Hi. My name's Ben, and I work with the rail division at Steer. And today I'm going to share with you some of the exciting new analysis we've been conducting into rail performance and what that's actually sort of revealing about congestion effects that we observe on the railway. Motivating this research is really the current performance challenge in the railway right now. So it's quite alarming how performance is degrading across the network as we see today. And in fact, over the last 7 years, we've seen a 5% increase in the number of train services, but a 73% increase in the number of late running services. This is a startling change, and illustrated on the chart behind me shows how this increase has occurred over time. And one big problem is that as an industry, we don't fully understand why this is happening and what's driving this change. Now, we can point to certain incidents, but overall, there's a significant missing link with how the timetable that we operate interacts with the performance that we see. And essentially, a simple question of, is the timetable today better or worse than it was 7 years ago is quite a difficult question for the industry right now. So I should note that we do have access as an industry to certain simulation tools in order to produce forecasts of an estimate of what performance might turn out like from a given timetable. But often these tools are restricted by the fact that they usually take months of preparation time in order to set up. And then once they are set up, these tools produce outputs. They don't produce insights. So whereas we may produce forecasts from them, we don't have a better understanding of why that forecast was what it was. And so at Steer, we've asked ourselves the question, can we estimate the impact from additional trains on the network and create these forecasts? So to answer this question, we at Steer are working towards what we call a strategic performance model. And quite simply, this is a tool that will be founded upon a series of research into relationships between the timetable structure and the outturn resilience that you see in your train services. And this will be founded upon looking at very detailed train timings data so that we're not making assumptions around what structure of performance relates to the timetable. And we're looking at the data almost in its raw form, you might say. And from that, we aim to create a faster, more insightful, and therefore with greater insight, a more robust model for forecasting the effects of timetable changes. So in order to develop this tool, we've started off by testing, you might say a rudimentary question, but albeit very important. We've asked the question of, can we actually determine a link between running a higher frequency of trains with any impacts upon the lateness of those train services? So what we've done is we've analysed trains operating between Huddersfield and Stalybridge. So it's about 17 miles of track, a two-track railway, quite simple geography in the north of England. And we've analysed every single train, so about 20,000 of them, in the financial year 16-17. And what we did was we took every individual train and we calculated the number of trains per hour in each fixed given hour based on those trains. Then, quite simply, we then determined the change in timings of trains as they move between Huddersfield and Stalybridge to calculate the lateness of those services. And then allocated each train a trains per hour value according to the hour that it operated in. So really what we got to was a simple table like this, where you have about 20,000 trains, and each one has a trains per hour value and a change in lateness value. So quite simple. But what we wanted to do was really try and understand what this data set was going to tell us and draw out the maximum value we could from this. And we wanted to observe whether trains per hour had an observable effect upon the lateness values that we saw. So what we did was we plotted the frequency of changes for each of these trains per hour categories, and we just plotted them one against each other. And I think you might quite enjoy the results. So I think first and foremost, we see quite a satisfying shape that we might have expected to see. You've got the short nose, thick middle, long tail, which really highlights the fact that you can recover some delay. You're more likely to stick around the timetable timings, but there's a propensity to gain unlimited delay, you might say, across the network. And importantly, to draw out from this chart, is that there is a significant shift, an observable shift, from moving from the green lines, the 3 and 4 trains per hour, to the 5, 6, and 7 trains per hour of the blue and dark red lines. And very interestingly, and importantly, this shows a non-linear impact from adding additional trains to the network, that we are seeing increased propensity towards higher lateness values when you run additional trains on this 2-track piece of railway. Now, I said just a moment ago that we analyzed a whole year of data. And whilst we did do that, right now I'm only showing you the summer period. So those of you well-versed with the rail industry will know that the autumn period is a particularly poor time for performance, and this is quite simply due to leaves falling off trees and getting stuck between the tracks and the train, and this causes some adhesion problems. So what we wanted to determine was, if we split out our data by season, can we actually observe an impact in this simple data set reflecting these performance effects in autumn? And I'm just going to show you autumn in a second. And when I do that, I want you to look at the tail on this distribution. And we can immediately see that there is a significant shift to the right, and in fact, the categories of trains hitting 3, 4, 5 minutes of lateness has actually distinctly increased. And these are the types of delays that are going to really impact passengers and ultimately punctuation at destination for trains. Now, I think looking at those results, we can see some interesting emerging behaviors, which are in the detail sense very, very compelling. But more importantly, I think it's key to reflect on the actual shape of the results that we saw. So they all followed this typical trend that we'd expect, this intuitive result where we have a short nose, a fat middle, and a long tail. And so knowing that this was an intuitive result, we wanted to see if we could explain this using a mathematical point of view. Because ultimately, train services running on the network are, they're undergoing a series of random delay events that occur to them, and they accumulate these delays over time. And this sort of thing is described quite nicely, actually, through a Poisson process, which is used to describe probabilities. So what we've done is to developed a framework for sort of describing this sort of behavior that we're seeing. And what we can do is create what we call a gamma distribution, which naturally follows on from Poisson processes, and creating quite a simple function with parameters A, where that represents your train per hour, and B, your expected lateness on individual trains. You can actually plot families of curves that look remarkably similar to the results we just saw from our data. And what this does is this, first off, gives us some actual theory to work with and compare back to our results. But more than that, this actually gives us quite a compelling, quite an exciting framework where we can actually start to play with parameters in our gamma curves and start to relate this to things on the network that we see today. And finally, what this does is actually gives us a way to actually start making predictions. What happens when you have more trains per hour than you've ever seen before? And this tool actually gives us a way to start making those forecasts, albeit there's more work to be done and more interesting behavior to be gained from this. But this is a really rich area that we've touched upon. Coming back to the start, we said we were looking to develop a strategic performance model. And what I've shown you is the first part of our analysis, so our sort of 1A, as we call it. But this consists of a family of analysis that we're going to conduct. And we've actually made further progress on this since, and we're trying to understand more of our results. But what we're doing is we're following a tree of analysis, and we're drilling down at each stage as we understand more about the process to draw out deeper and deeper relationships until we can make a powerful model using these behaviors that we found and develop a mathematical model around that to explain them. And to come back to that original question of can we forecast the impact of additional trains on the network, well, I think we've shown right here that an increased number of trains is leading us to a nonlinear increase in the lateness of those train services. And to give you a sort of scale of that in your mind, what we've seen in those 3, 4 trains per hour moving to 5, 6, and 7, we've seen actually a 70% increase in the lateness, in the average lateness on those services in that section of track. Quite a scary figure, and I think we'll see that change over time. But already this is giving us some quite exciting results that giving us some insights into what's actually happening today on the railway.
Very much, Ben. So has anybody got any immediate questions?
I just wondered, on that piece of track, did you do any research on how passenger behaviour is on boarding the trains?
As of yet, we haven't got to that particular question. We deliberately took timings of trains coming into Huddersfield and then compared that to timings of trains arriving into Stalybridge. So there are some boarding effects that will occur, but I think, and what that will do is that will feed into later levels of analysis. As we drill down, we find weird behavior that we don't understand. We can then start to ask and then answer those questions.
Hi, I was just wondering, did Network Rail adjust the timetable in any way prior or post the analysis? Because that could clearly affect actually the results that are coming out, and they could just decide to make the trains run slower.
No, that's an entirely valid question. So first off, what we tried to do is avoid any May or December timetable changes during this process. So no planned significant timetable changes should be occurring during each of these intervals. And also by separating them up, the likelihood of changes occurring within these different time periods is much reduced, and we would see a diverging significant behaviour beyond the autumnal effects as we move between the seasons. So I don't think we've seen any significant behaviours, and we've deliberately tried to mitigate against May and December timetable changes.